Hello everybody and welcome to another game theory video. So this video is going to be all about a particular game design element that came up as a part of a Twitter conversation I was having with Paul Conti. So thanks Paul for inspiring me for this video. But Paul made a comment after the show on Wednesday that we had of Warhammer Weekly to the effect of wondering when a game is actually finished. Basically, he said something to the effect of, it seems like they're still doing a lot of R&D on Age of Sigmar. And I said, well, yes, of course, because that's just the nature of designing games. Game designers actually have to do constant evolution and R&D, and a game is never really finished. And this is sort of a strange concept for people that don't design games, who probably just assume that when you make a game, it's done. But of course, what I'm going to put forward as a thesis in this video is that that's not the case. So, let's get into it, and we'll see if I can bring you along with me, and see if by the end of it you agree with me. So, if we're going to talk about this, the first thing we should cover is generally how a game is made. So we should talk about the design phase of a game. And so the normal process of a game looks something like this. Now, this is grossly oversimplified, and also this is cutting out lots of important people like editors and layout artists and regular artists and, printers and stuff like that. I'm just talking about the actual design of the mechanical core of the game here, right? So you have an idea, so you do some kind of design on that idea. It's going to then generally go to development, and development takes the raw design and fashions it down into be a more functional product, double checks your math, make sure that you're using similar terminology, make sure that things work. In general, then you'll have some kind of testing phase, and then you have a release. Now, as well, we've got the secondary arrow going from testing to design, because obviously, as part of the results of testing, you may have to go back to design and repeat that process any number of times before you actually get to a release. Now, if this process seems vaguely familiar to you because you happen to work in, say, like the software industry or something, yes, it is a very similar process. I should say, however, that the ideation for this, of having this development being separate from design, is honestly a relatively new thing to the game design market. It wasn't always this way. For a long time, game design was seen as this more artistic process that was sort of the birth of the, a single person has an idea, they write their brilliant golden idea, and they bequeath it to the world. Here, look at this beautiful thing that I have created. Behold and gaze upon its magnificence. This was sort of the idea that came out of the, the 70s, and you had these rock star designers, people like Gary Gygax, who would make these games. And it continued well through into the 90s, when you had people like Richard Garfield breaking the world open with magic and stuff. But as time went on, and these games became the province of very large companies, they realized that if their game was going to be successful at a massive level, it had to have some kind of rigor around the process. And so formal design and development verticals were established, and, sort of more rules of the road. Now, there's still a lot of art in this quote-unquote science, okay? But that's roughly how it looks. And even in a small group, like my small company like myself, when I design games, Tom, my co-host on Warhammer Weekly, is my lead developer. He does development. I don't touch it. And I do most of the design. He doesn't touch that. And the reason we keep those separate are because then we each have our own thing we are responsible for, and we don't get in each other's business. And we each have clear, separate vantage points to what we need to do. So, it seems like at first blush, the goal of this would be to create a finished product. And that's true, but what do we mean by finished? Okay, so let's talk about that word, finished. I want you to get in your head what you think I mean by a finished game, okay? I'll give you a second. Think about it. All right, let's go to the next slide. So, at first, it seems obvious. The game should just be done, right? Why are we even talking about this? So, I'll submit, though, that done isn't as clear as we would imagine at first blush. Done means we're ready for release to some degree, right? In other words, in my mind, what done means is we have a finished working game. But again, we need to drill deeper. What does working game mean? What is that? Like, I'm using a lot of normative terms here, okay? So let's get very specific. Done means the game plays to about 2, 3, standards of deviation. In other words, most situations are going to work without issue. However, done doesn't mean that everything has been explored, all design space you've created has been mapped, that all questions are answered, or that most critically, and this is definitely true, that even the designer of the game fully understands the game they have made. Okay? Full stop. Because that's going to be, I suspect, a strange concept for people. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's what you all think too. But I will tell you from my perspective, this was a revelation for me when I designed games. Or started doing this. I thought, when I make the game, I'm going to really understand the game. But it's just not the case. Because of reasons we're going to talk about more deeply in a moment. But effectively, any sufficiently complicated thing has a lot of potential combinations that you're not going to explore. And as a designer, you might not even really grasp right away some of the things you can get into. So let's kind of take a look at that a little deeper. All right, this is my question. What? How could the designer not understand their own game? So this is my thesis statement. In any game of sufficient complexity, the designer will not have the time or ability to understand or test all possible interactions or to explore all possible design space. Okay? Those are two separate but important concepts. Okay? The first is because of the level and the number of game elements I create, I don't have the time to test every single thing working with every single other thing. Okay? So I can't put A with B and C and D and E and F and so on out to the end of the design elements, and then run the same test again with B and everything, and then run the same test. And you get what I'm saying here, right? And then it gets more complicated because, of course, we're not just limited to 2. It can be 3 things shoved together, 4 or 5, whatever these game elements happen to be. The second thing is different. When you create a set of rules, you're creating basically a universe, a set of design space that you as a designer can interact with. This is especially true in exception-based gaming, which is most of what we play. Okay? Because exception-based gaming lends itself to future development. For the most part, war games, card games, RPGs are exception-based games. What that means is simply there is a set of rules, and then every other specific thing you write usually either directly acts upon one of those rules, twists one of those rules, or outright breaks one of those rules. All right, let's consider Magic. So this is a relatively recent card, the Shadowborn Apostle. This is a very fun card for a couple reasons. It's a 1 black, 1/1, but look at the very first thing it says. A deck can have any number of cards named Shadowborn Apostle. Now, if you know Magic, you know that normally one of the standard rules of the game is you're limited to 4 of any given card. Right? And right here printed on this card is an exception rule that breaks that core rule, right? And the reason I like Magic, to use it as an example, is because Magic is really interesting. This is the first time I saw this particular effect printed on a card. This is M14s. This came out in like 2013. Okay, end of. And that's almost 20 years into Magic. Now, they didn't have the 4-card limit right at the beginning, but still, we can say for roughly 20 years, roundabout, the game of Magic has remained incredibly stable. Like, the vast majority of the rules have remained stable. Yes, there have been changes, like the way the stack works and when it gets invoked, the existence of the stack has changed. But when you think of what's the same, right? The types of cards, the colors, the basic mechanics, the interactions, the very core mechanics of the game, the mass stuff, that hasn't changed. It's a lot of creatures and instants and interrupts and lands, and you play lands to get mana. That mana summons things or casts spells. I have a turn, you have a turn. You can act during my turn for certain spells, and not others. And for the most part, that's remained stable. Now, one of the interesting developments was sometime recently, they have created new cards, right? Or new types, like they added to the core set of game elements. So we can look at things like a Planeswalker, which was a new card type. Though he's still blue, he still costs mana to use, right? He still interacts with combat and can be attacked and things like that. So, but it was a new element. And these two cards capture very well what I'm talking about, right? And very, very importantly, these two cards capture it. The first card, the Shadowborn Apostle, is all about exploring design space. By making a rule, you may only have 4 of any given card in your deck. You then create design space, because the design space around that one rule is now maybe this card you can have no more than 1 of in your deck. Like, we could just as easily see a card that says, you may not have more than 1 of these in your deck, right? That could be a rule. In fact, that's a sort of a meta rule by certain formats that limit things like very powerful cards, but wouldn't necessarily have to be. You could go other directions. Or obviously what we see here is where you can have any number of them, right? So that standard rule, by invoking the rule, we created a new map of design space that I, as a designer, can now tweak and play with. And it took them a long time to get to a rule like to explore this particular space. But every single rule you make, every single rule, think of how big your rule books are. Every single rule has a map of design space that could be huge around it when you start making exceptions about it. Jace is an example of the other thing, okay, where he's exploring, new interactions and ways of working. And despite the fact that Magic is the most heavily, rigorously play-tested, design developed game in the world, its design rigor and process and expertise amongst its core group is just beyond what most other companies can muster. Despite that, this card still got made and broke the meta because it had all these really bad interactions, right? The point being, testing can't solve this. There is no more aggressive... You can limit it, but you can never solve it. And there's a difference, okay? A really, really important difference. Is your goal really good, okay? Like, that is to say, where most things work fine, and most players will play the game every day without running into issues, or is your goal perfection? Because quite obviously, you'll never reach the latter, okay? Jace is one of those exceptions. Magic hasn't had many cards that have come out in, say, the past decade that have accidentally broken things, but this guy was one of them, right? Not every Planeswalker did. Most Planeswalkers did. In fact, most are junk, but this one did. Okay? And the other good example of how testing can't solve your problem is D&D 5e. So, I was lucky enough to participate as a consultant in the design of 5e. It was great. I loved everything about it. It's made by... 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons is made by some of the smartest game designers working in the business today. People who have an undying passion for the game of Dungeons & Dragons and its full history. They made a beautiful, wonderful game. I was happy to help in any way that I could. It went through the largest public playtest in history. And as of right now, it has like a 20-plus page FAQ. And it has... There's a collection of all of the Twitter questions that have been answered, because both of the lead designers constantly answer questions on Twitter in regards to rules questions or interactions or things like that, some of which are sort of legitimate problems, some are just confusion, and that is a running document of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of tweets that they have taken the time to answer. So, that's my point, right? Now, some of those, admittedly, are just people not understanding something, and so it's clarification. But some of them are legitimate problems that get found. In any game of sufficient complexity, the designers themselves don't necessarily, at the onset, understand all the design space. Like, when I made that rule of 4 cards, I didn't even necessarily understand the ways that I could screw with it. That's a simple one, right? Because I can say, well, I could go down or up with that number. All right, maybe that's a simple one to map, to understand the map of the design space. But certainly with other more complicated things, you're not going to be able to see the whole map right away. And it takes time in playing with your game itself for you to seize upon other ways you could explore the space. Really move around, use the space. All right, so let's talk about interactions a little deeper. So, for me, one of the big challenges as a game designer is that if you want to make a game, sort of sufficiently large and complex enough to remain interesting over a long period of time, you're going to naturally get yourself in a situation where you can't test every single combination. It just becomes sort of impossible. I think of like the Matrix when, whatever his name, Cypher or whatever, is sitting there and he's like, it's too big to render. It's just you're looking at the code or whatever, right? Well, it's too big to test every single thing. Doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to test. Doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to understand your game. You must and should. But, like I said, you'll never reach perfection. And in the delta in between expertise and perfection lies both discovery of additional places to explore, but also challenges and problems and sort of bad rules interactions. And so what you get into is this cycle. You have a release. That release introduces additional game elements, or perhaps your initial game elements if it's your first release. You create additional design space, right, when you have that release because you realized a new rule you made suddenly expanded out your map of other things you could do. But it also created additional challenges because of those new rules and their interactions, which leads you to another release to either clean up those things, explore the additional design space, work with the additional game elements that you made in the last one, continue refining them, and so on and so forth. And this is a never-ending cycle, right? And it's good that this is a never-ending cycle, I should mention. This is beneficial. This is mutually beneficial to both we as consumers and the company as a company that's making the game. It is this infinite cycle that allows games to be made, because if they're going to be a sort of enterprise, for-profit enterprise, not every game made is part of a for-profit enterprise, but admittedly, most are, and making them in a not-for-profit enterprise, say like the Ninth Age, is a Herculean effort, and that's why, again, every time I talk about T9A, I talk about how incredible everybody who's involved in that project is. But not every game could be made like that. It takes a lot of passion. But note that even the Ninth Age is going to fall into this cycle because they're going to want to do additional releases. They have, and every time they do and something changes, additional game elements get added, additional design space gets explored, additional challenges arise, and so we have another release. That's one of the things that's going on right now is they're refining the game down in like 1.2, 1.3. But this is true in Age of Sigmar and every version of Magic and D&D and everything. It really doesn't matter. You're going to run into this over and over and over again. It is this repetition that allows companies to be profitable because they can introduce new things that you are interested in. It allows you to enjoy the game long term and remain invested in it because it provides for new elements, additional game elements. That's what that is. For you to explore, collect, participate in, play against, keep the game interesting, right? And because it is the rare game that can have a single format and that be it forever, those games are limited to basically like chess and a few others such as that. And even then, you're not exactly looking to go to your game club probably every weekend for most people to play a game of chess, though there's people who are out there, and that's fine. So it is this cycle that's very valuable. And this cycle, right, naturally has, what do I want to say? It's not a perfect process. It has inefficiencies. There's friction, right? And it's both a good friction, because it allows the designers to create additional space to explore, but also a dangerous friction because it also creates additional challenges and problems and errors and questions and blah, 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 blah. So let's bring this back to Warhammer, because that's always how these go. So think about, say, current Age of Sigmar, right? What have you got? You've got war scrolls, battalions, terrain, scenarios, magic items, and more, right? When all of these items interact with the basic rules, you get unusual situations. For the most part, these things work, right? All these things work together. I've played a lot of games, just, I don't know, one to two games every weekend since the game came out. And for the most part, we don't have a lot of issues. Most things just work, right? And having all of these different elements makes for a sufficiently rich and complex experience. Now, I will say this is one of the reasons I was so happy that the GHB was introduced, because it did add in back some of these elements. Like we got back, say, our magic items, command abilities, things like that. These were nice additional elements that were added into the game to explore. We all were happy about them. However, when they were introduced, in addition to opening up the design space that they created, and for the most part they worked, they also then added additional challenges, right? So all of these things are coming. We see that cycle and process. It's never going to get perfection out of this. There are going to be outliers, questions, problems, and often straight up contradictions, because that's how exception-based design works. When you have a set of core rules and you say, the way we're going to do this is by the individual game elements we make will either act upon or break those basic rules. Sometimes you will break the rules in mutually exclusive ways, and then those two things will need to interact, and that can be a problem. The key is you have to continually follow the cycle and make sure that these issues are addressed. So that really brings my core thesis back around. That's why I say a game is never really finished. You're always in this cycle of addressing the issues and problems that arise out of the introduction of game elements or the discovery of interactions. Because sometimes it can even take the players quite a long time to find the problem. It can be a corner of a corner of a corner of a corner case, and it might not even be found by a lot of people playing the game. That's one of the things that happened with 5th edition. I mean, they had tens of thousands of playtesters actively playing and submitting data, and yet when the game launched and it went out to millions of people, it didn't. Months later, a couple issues were found. It took millions of people months of play to finally find these particular issues, right? Because some of them are so rare or unusual or whatever. So at the same time, like as we continue to push special abilities in the Age of Sigmar and explore what's possible in the basic rules, additional unusual situations are going to happen. We should already see at this point that the seemingly simple skeletal structure of Age of Sigmar, the ever so often quoted 4 pages of rules, can yield incredibly complex results, right? Which is the entire heart of exception-based game design. Exception-based game design doesn't need a hugely complex set of base rules. In fact, the simpler the base, the better. Because all you really need is to create a sufficiently large map of potential design space where you can rest exceptions upon to explore. Magic has a lot of simple elements, right? There's a couple types of cards. There's 5 colors. I use land. I summon things. I attack. Most of these mechanics are simple. I've taught people Magic in 5 or 10 minutes. But the amount of complexity they can mine out of Magic is just mind-boggling because of the way that you then explore the exceptions to make cards. So there'll always be new and interesting interactions, but they'll always bring challenges. Now, I want to put a final proof on this to hopefully convince you of just how complicated things can get. Let's talk about rolling a dice or a die, okay? That's it. To resolve something, you roll a die. That's a rule certainly in Age of Sigmar and in 1,000 other games, right? To do X, I don't care what it is, roll a die. All right? Now, let's talk about the ways we could break that rule. We could say, so in other words, 2 hit, roll a 4. That's the rule. Okay? Okay. Well, I could say you roll X number of dice and pick the best Y. If any of them are successes, you hit. If any of them are 4 or better, you hit. I could say you can reroll that die. I can say you can roll twice. That's the first one. Right? I can just reroll it. I don't get to roll twice. I just get to roll once. Then if it fails, I can reroll. I could reroll only X. In other words, reroll ones. I could set to X. In other words, I can change the result of the die in some limited way. I could set to X plus or minus, right? So I can increase. One version is set it to a 6. One version is if I roll a 2, I can up it by 1 to 3. I could explode the die on a roll of X. So if I roll a 6, I get to roll an additional die, and that keeps happening. I could trigger an effect on a roll of X, besides just the explosion, right? I could say, if I roll a 3 or better, then this other thing happens over here on this other unit, or this other game element, does something, or also then rolls a separate die, which could trigger its own effects. I can add bonuses and penalties to the roll, +1, -1. I can have inverse effects. In other words, I can prevent any of the above. I can say, against this unit, you never get to reroll your X, whatever it is, right? I have not mapped in this all of the potential design space just for rolling a die, okay? And you can see here, I hope, how some of these things could interact strangely, right? For example, I could have a reroll X and a set to X come up against each other. And then, well, what happens, right? Because this thing says I get to reroll it if it's this number, but this other thing says I get to set it to a particular number. So if I set it to that number, does it then get to be rerolled? Maybe, maybe not. Is there an order of operations? You know, these complex interactions off of the simple exploration of the design space of rolling a die. I cannot think of a simpler thing in the game, and yet we could map out of all of this 1,000 complex interactions, right? So, there you go. That's why I say games are never really finished, because you're always going to be learning new ways, new things like the list I have here, with the elements you have in your game or in a game, to figure out, to explore, to push it, to test new space, to create new interesting elements. With that, you're going to bring additional interactions, which are going to create interest in your product, but at the same time are going to create future challenges and problems as people discover bad interactions. And so the cycle will repeat. So is a game ever really finished? My answer is hopefully not, because we wouldn't want it to be. We want it to be playable. We want it to be good, great even. We want it to be done enough that for the vast majority of cases, those interactions are fine. What I don't think is fair to expect, because I certainly have never seen a game achieve it, or know how you would even do so, is perfection, right? Where you can never have a bad situation. So, there you go. Those are my thoughts on, is a game ever really finished? I hope you enjoyed this little, sort of game theory, game design video. If you did, hey, give it a like. Subscribe for this and other videos in the future. I like talking about game design. It's something that fascinates me. And, of course, we'll be touching on this subject again in the future. If you did enjoy it, always the nicest thing you can do is share it with somebody else. That's always great. And we'll see you next time.